to our lives. You can occasionally appreciate how the plane enables a new way of seeing. The weatherless sky above the clouds, the gridded landscape, and maybe even something you've never seen before, like catching the sun as it sweeps impossibly across the inside of the cabin. Michael Worthington is a designer. Being a designer today means that you are directly complicit in today's technology and media-saturated world. Riding through the whirlwind of this accelerating culture, however, Michael's extraordinary work allows you to stop, understand things in a new way, and maybe see things you've never seen before. Michael Worthington's design has received multiple awards and has appeared in dozens and dozens of publications internationally, including Teschen's new graphic design for the 21st century. He is often involved in writing and editorial projects and has lectured widely internationally. Having received his MFA from CalArts in the early 90s, he returned to teach there and eventually head the graphic design program, which he co-directs with designer Louise Sandhaus. It is my pleasure to introduce Michael Worthington tonight. Thank you.
Hi. Can we turn these down a little? So what I thought I'd do by way of an introduction is, since Tim filled you in on all the real history, I thought I would try and give you some kind of insight into why I design things the way that I do. There was a quote from Roland Barthes that says, "Style is an organized network of obsessions." And in some ways it seems to mirror graphic design as a cultural practice, in that historically graphic designers have tend to be people that tend to represent other cultures and other cultural practices. And in recent years, I got very interested in how, rather than just kind of representing those cultures, graphic design could actually refract them, could actually change them as well as representing them, so that design became an important cultural practice in itself. And when I started to think about this Roland Barthes quote, I started to think about all the things that might have influenced me, that might have made me think about, all the things that had influenced me and might have influenced the way that I design. And I also wrote this as a kind of response to the AAGA, the American Institute of Graphic Artists, who I think last year they dropped the term graphic from all their literature. And it seemed really weird for them to be suddenly embarrassed about being graphic designers at a time when, for me, I thought it was the recent years have been the first time that people really understand what graphic design is. And I think something like Chip Kidd's Cheese Monkeys book is a really good example of that, where the subject matter, the protagonist is a graphic designer, but the book is for anybody. The book isn't for just people that study graphic design. It's actually a piece of fiction where everybody understands what graphic design is and just accepts it without even questioning it. I like graphic design. I like pens and pencils, ink and paper, paint, crayons, photographs, and scissors. I like the computer. I like grids and pixels and layers and filters and endless variations and versions and revisions. I like books as physical objects. I like digital realms as fluid living organisms. I like design tools. I like the possibilities they offer. I like graphic design. I like mistakes and accidents. I like the unexpected and the unusual. I like diagrams, especially ones that explain something complicated by making it simple. I like cool trainers. I like new socks. I like jeans that don't shrink, cotton underwear, subversive t-shirts, flowery shirts, jackets. I like jackets a lot, and bags. I like to cut my own hair. I like dub. I like that the empty spaces are just important as the full ones. I like punk, English, 76 to 79. I like the Clash, the Jam, Joy Division, the Fall, the Smiths, Johnny Cash, and Leonard Cohen. Bell and Sebastian, Black Sabbath, Drum and Bass, Pavement, Plod, Plone, Pulp, Tortoise Ride, Interpol, the Postal Service, Wimp Rock, Bedroom Metal, Aphex Twin, Ortecris and Etienne, the Specials, Fridge, Fortet, the Fucking Champs, Augustus Pablo, King Tubby, Prince Jammy, Lee Perry, the scientist and the mad professor. I like version. I like heavy manners. I like gorillas versus space monkey. I like David Bowie, before Scary Monsters and after The Laughing Gnome. I like Scott Walker. I like bad cover versions. I like bad karaoke better than perfect karaoke. I like vinyl, but I don't cry over its demise. I like the fact that my CDs are color-coded. I like the fact that the spines make a subtle gradation from black through blue, purple, red, orange, yellow, green, brown, earth, and white. I like this because I like graphic design. I like specificity. I like solving problems. I like context-specific solutions. I like the personal. I like sex and typography. I like technology, criticism, and critique. I like passion. I like that Sunday mornings feel like Sunday mornings. I like details, drop shadows, outlines, gutters and edges. I like events outside the frame. I like hidden meanings and messages, secret graphic languages. I like design when it has a reason to exist. I like compositions and space and full and empty and layers and textures and making. I like making. I like form. I like complexity and I like simplicity. I like complex simplicity and simple complexity. But I also like simple simplicity and complex complexity. I like contradictions and discussions, but I like to get my own way. I like cataloging possibilities. I like to consider the ill-considered. I like thinking about why things should look the way they look. I like Raymond Carver. I like Joe Strummer. I like Dylan Thomas. I like Alan Moore and Scott McCloud. I like Borges and Marquez and Raymond Queneau. I like Italo Calvino. I like Calvino a lot. I like the reading of writing. I like the rhythm and shape of words. I like the poetics of language. I like personal modernism. I like crafty technology. I like ornamental crime. I like slogos and I like manifestos. I like to make the system break the system. I like Robert Brownjohn, Carl Gerstner, Herb Luberlin, Karl Martens, Sister Corita Kent, Quentin Fiore, Herbert Spencer, Barney Bubbles, Vaughan Oliver, Peter Saville, Bruno Munari, Willem Sandberg, GTF, DWR, WDRU, Experimental Jet Set, Inema Baum, Saul and Elaine Bass. I like Matty Klarwein, Bas Jan Ader, Paul Thek, Robert Smithson, and Robert Overby. I like George Nelson. I like Peter Zumthor. I like experiential architecture. I like Kenneth Anger. I like Lucifer Rising. I like typography of almost any shape, size, or style, as long as it is considered. I like humanistic irregularities. I like imperfect modularity. I like to kern. I like to justify. I like to add ligatures. I like to eliminate rivers, widows, and orphans. I like to shape rags by hand. I like non-lining numerals and M dashes and N dashes and curly quotes and hanging punctuation. I like graphic design. I like the sun when my eyes are closed. I like being underwater with my eyes open. I like scoring goals in soccer. Beautiful, skillful goals. I dream about those goals. I like the colors in the desert when the sun is setting and isn't quite bright enough to bleach everything. I like airplanes, rough seas, and snow, but only for about 30 minutes. I like shapes and colors in various arrangements. I like textures, objects, light, marks. I like words and images. I like concepts, systems, and methodologies. I like graphic design. So one of the things that I find interesting about doing lectures and talks is that it forces me to look back at my own body of work and try and draw some conclusions from it. And a lot of the time it's very hard. I look at it and it looks fractured and discombobulated, and I'm not sure that it looks like the same person made all the pieces of work. And the benefit to me of giving these lectures is that it really makes me reflect on what I've done and how that work might hold together, what kind of threads exist through that work. And quite often they're not formal threads at all. It isn't that the work looks the same, it's that somehow there's some underlying strategies that tie the work together. And as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of Italo Calvino, and during the end of his life, he gave a series of lectures that was then published called 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, and he only actually wrote 5 of them before he died, but it was him looking back at his own writing and trying to pretty much analyze and critique his own writing and where it came from. And I tried to do something similar for this lecture, but given that I'm not as talented or far-sighted as Calvino, I wrote you 6 memos for the next year instead of the next millennium. So the first one is to create context or content-specific design. One of the things that I think my work has in common is that it's always considered in terms of the context that it's going to be seen in, as well as how it should react or interrelate with the content. So the design never comes before the content. In fact, a lot of the time it's the other way around. The design, I have no idea what the design is going to look like or how it's going to function, but it comes out of the content itself, from reading that content, from understanding it, thinking about how it might exist. And this was a magazine called Xtra that was a magazine about art criticism that I designed a volume of a few years ago, and it was a super cheap 2-color printing job. And each issue had a theme, and so I tried to use those themes to force the design of each issue. So this first issue was called Lost and Found, and the cover was a set of lost and found posters off the street that were all overlaid together. And then there was no contents page. In the very first page in the magazine, all the articles started on the same page, so there was no need for any contents. And the idea was that you would follow these slightly differing typographic threads for each story, and you'd actually be able to get lost and found within the text. So you would start to jump from one article to another without really knowing it. And the second issue of this was about gardens. And I got very interested in just structurally the different kind of gardens that you could have and how this might relate formally to kind of typographic approaches, from things that were very structured, that were very kind of organic, to things that referenced more kind of mazes or perhaps Victorian horticulture. This issue was about criticism. I should also and then I built a sort of space for myself at the back of each issue where I could make some little commentary about what I thought was going on with the design. And the X always represented Xtra somehow. And here it was being crushed under the weight of criticism. And with this issue, I really kind of didn't connect with the content itself. So I found myself trying to make the most boring thing I possibly could, which was kind of interesting because the last issue was potentially a much more Baroque approach. And I thought it was going to be really easy. I thought I could just do everything in 10-point Helvetica. And it was really hard. It was really hard to let go of everything and just accept this really sort of minimal approach. So there were points where there were just like frames and empty picture boxes and just a 2-column grid of the same size text. And then they decided to do another issue about criticism, which kind of flummoxed me because then I didn't know what to do. And I tried kind of starting off with the same approaches and basically it ended up being a much more sort of decorative, minimal approach. Slightly after that, I made a series of books for an artist called Uta Barth, and this was the first book that I made. And they were to represent separate bodies of work, and the first body of work was, they were all photographs she'd taken in one room throughout a year. And they were really about just the play of kind of light and space within this one room, this view from a window. And the book, the actual plates in the book, the photographs, were very kind of cleanly represented. They were just shown as pairs most of the time. But the intro to the book and the back of the book, there were these very subtle kind of plays of light and shifts in in tone in the printing that almost looked like kind of light moving across the pages. In a lot of ways, it was actually trying to take her aesthetic and what I thought was her kind of reasoning behind her making artwork and to apply that to design in order to create a sympathetic frame. And it was fairly difficult to do because it involved being very minimal and actually not doing very much as a designer and really considering every move. And in some ways it was antithetical to the kind of approach that I'd been taught at CalArts as a student. So a lot of the pages, the footnotes, for instance, had this kind of structural device where they would fade throughout the book through different colors as if time was passing and the light was changing. And the structure came out of the sort of lattice work structure of the window and the photographs. To the point where it got to the very end pages were very, very minimal and there was almost nothing there at all, just this tiny piece of shadow. And then I made a second book that was a companion that was the same kind of idea, but a little more refined. So it used the same kind of language. There were these tiny little shifts in tone in the printing where you can barely see, almost shadows from the windows hitting the light, hitting the surface of the book. And the idea was to kind of create this atmosphere that was similar to the atmosphere the photographs created. And it really made me think about what I was doing as a designer and how much influence I had in actually kind of changing how the work was read, how somebody else's work was kind of read just by the frame that I was putting it in a way. And it's back to that idea about it was actually kind of refracting rather than just reflecting it. And this was a book that I designed with Lorraine Wild, which was the last book for Uta Barth, which was a sort of larger piece. And one of the things that happens in her work a lot is there's a lot of things that happen outside the frame, and it was a kind of strategy that we tried to develop as a way to show her photographs. And in some ways, I'd exhausted the other ideas that I had about her work for the two smaller books, and this very much became about a sort of a different idea. It became about what happens outside the frame, what's implied to be happening in a photograph but isn't necessarily shown. So even the title of the book was In Between Places, so it crops down on the cover to say between place, and the front and the back, actually the title bleeds over so that you can read it. And a lot of the pages have these tiny little strips at the side, and they're actually kind of pieces of photographs that are yet to come or that have previously occurred. So they become these ideas of things happening outside the frame or suggestions of things. And again, the actual design of the book is fairly traditional, fairly conservative. To try and get a different feeling from the other books, we actually talked with Uta, and her work is meticulously cropped, and she spends a really long time shooting each photograph. And we actually convinced her to allow me to recrop her photographs as long as they were shown somewhere else in the book. So we started to make these really sort of interesting pairings that kind of became exercises in composition as well. So there were things like these with the pieces that would cross the gutter. There became interesting relationships between the pages. And even the kind of the title typography was, I think it was Arial, which was like this generic web typeface. That somehow when you blew it up, it had this strange, slightly disconcerting feeling that it was really normal, but there was somehow something a little tiny bit wrong with it. So here you can see the images are bleeding over from one edge to the next. And this is a project that actually Alan and Linda created for the Mac Center. I think Peter Nerva was talked here in the last week, yeah? So this was the catalog for that show. And again, the form of the book really came out of the work of the artists. And it was a project where there were a number of artists who were asked to create architectural projects. And to begin with in the project, all the different artists thought they were going to have a separate book as a publication. So what happened was everybody had 12 people had 12 different ideas about what their book should look like. And my job was to try and figure out how all these things might coexist. So I created a structure where everybody had these kind of intro pages, and then after that there was a lot of fluidity in terms of how their work might look, and it was the intro pages that kind of held the work together. And Pete, who was working for me at the time, one of my ex-students, drew this typeface that was based on a kind of blueprint, whereby you could scale it up to any size and it would always remain the same line weight. So some of the pages ended up being very loose and very kind of like funky, and so this was meant to look more like a kind of construction, a kind of low-tech construction manual. And some of the other pieces acted more like projects in themselves. This was Renee Petropolis, who had taken all these pieces from photographs of gas stations and mini-marts, and then she actually gave them to me, and we reconstructed them into these compositions. Always consider the ill-considered. I think that often when you make design, you tend to have an idea of how you're going to work and what the outcome is going to be in your head. And for me, it sort of follows this diagram, which is kind of my process, where you think you're going to generate an idea, and then you're going to kind of organize it and edit it and develop it and talk about it and gradually hone it and craft it and refine it down, till at the end you reach this point of perfection. And it seems to rarely work like that. It actually seems to be much more like this, which is a kind of tangled mess. And often the thing that you're looking for is right near the point that you started, but you still have to go down these kind of tangled pathways. And some of that led me to believe that sometimes it's interesting to try and to do things that you don't think you want to do, or the things that might be seemingly problematic, in order to create something new and to keep yourself interested in your own work in a way. And this was a poster that I made for SCI-Arc for this lecture series a couple of years ago. And I got really interested in the idea of how a poster functions and what a poster is and what graphic design is versus architecture. And what I thought about was that designers tend to treat things that are printed physically, particularly posters, as two-dimensional objects, when in fact they're three-dimensional, but we never think of the width or the volume of a poster. We just think of it as a surface, often only one surface. And I decided that I wanted to make somehow a kind of three-dimensional poster, and something that had volume, that was kind of architectural. And so I made an inflatable poster. And the poster came rolled down with a pump, and each person that got it had to actually pump and inflate the poster. And the inside text for all the speakers was printed on the inside of the vinyl with this kind of blue panel printed on top of it on the other surface. So when you got it, you couldn't read anything unless you blew it up. So you actually had to blow it up in order to get the information. You had to create this physical object. And the design itself with a lot of the people talking had these hybrid practices, and the design with these sort of hybrid animals that were made from a typeface that they were actually the initials of each of the different people. So the poster ended up being this, you inflate it, it's this three-dimensional thing. There's gaps in the side so the light can come in, and you can actually peek through the holes in order to read the information. And the other reason it was ill-considered was because it cost so much to print that I didn't actually get paid for the job. And the invite for it was a similar kind of thing. It was screen printed on a plastic so that it was two-sided and created shadows. This was an identity project that I did last year for Orange County Museum of Art. And they chose 3 designers to propose a new identity for them. And in the end, they didn't pick. I made 3 proposals for them. I'm just going to show you one of them. But they didn't pick this one. And the reason why it was ill-considered was I kind of knew they wouldn't pick it, and in some ways it was sort of antithetical to Orange County and to a museum in Orange County. But in another way, it was, I felt it was something that would have so radically changed their identity and forced them to kind of shift and adjust their mission in a way, or actually to align, their mission was to be a more contemporary cutting-edge arts institution. And so my idea was to give them this very contemporary cutting-edge identity. And it actually functioned in a very similar way to how I felt a museum functions, in that it was a physical space. So the first thing I tried to do was think of the space if it was empty. If there was nothing in the gallery, what would the gallery be? So this idea of a kind of empty space that could be filled with something. And the thing that it could be filled with could depend on whatever art was being shown in the gallery, whatever particular thing was influencing the cultural institution at that time. So at some point, the logo could, the identity could be kind of stripy. If it was reacting to another kind of show, it could take on a different kind of form. And it would always be pasted within this, structure, this kind of conceptual structure of the museum. So we made hundreds of these variations showing how different people might use them. And part of the identity system was actually that it would exist online, and that the different people, like kids that were interested in art or in the museum, could actually fill them in themselves and submit them to the museum, and they would be constantly updated on the website and used as part of the identity. But it would actually force an interaction between the public and the museum as well, which was one of their parts of their mission statement. So we figured out how to kind of make it work in black and white, and from ones that were really simple to something like this that was really kind of complex. So for things like, the accounting office could have theirs full of numbers. And basically anybody could personalize their own card as well, that everybody could have a kind of individual identity within the overall museum identity. And so we made newsletters and magazines and calendars. And 2 ex-students from CalArts worked on this project with me as well, Max Erdenberger and Mina Ko. But they didn't choose it. I think they chose the word orange in orange, which was very exciting conceptually, but it works for them. Make the system, break the system. As I started to do more book work, I got really interested in how you might set up a structure or a methodology or a system, and then fill that structure or system full of work, in some ways irregardless of what it was you were filling it with. In other words, to allow it to kind of overflow or to break in a way. And one of the first things that I did that was this little book called Things That Quicken the Heart. And it was actually a book of writing from faculty and some students at CalArts. And it was mainly people that weren't writers. It was, artists and filmmakers. And I wrote a piece of fiction for it as well. And around that same time I was doing a lot of web design, and I started to cross over the sort of strategies that I was using in web design and interactivity with the strategies I was using in print design on a really basic level. So one of the things with this book was I asked all the people that wrote if they would give me objects that they held dear to their heart. And the idea was that these objects were emotional, it was somehow points of emotional epiphany, that they were these tiny little objects that to everybody else seemed just like, oh, it's a feather or it's a weight. But to that person, somehow they triggered some kind of memory, or they were really important because I went on a date with this person and they gave me this feather, or I found this when my granddad died. Or I like this idea of these objects being kind of somehow infused with emotion, and whether I could find a way to kind of draw that out of them. And these objects became quite literally the things that quicken the heart. And then I sort of paired them up in these in these ways to make kind of connections between the images. It's to do with either word play or formal play. And this section was printed on, the book's very small. It's meant to be this very personal, intimate book that you can put in your pocket and carry around with you. And this interior section was printed, it was actually printed by a Bible company, and it was printed on Bible paper, so it was incredibly thin. And you could see, what you can't get from the slides is you can see the interior typography through the images. And I built a space for me to play typographically, because I couldn't play with the text because people needed to read that. They needed to get lost in kind of book space, to lose sight of the surface of the page in order to understand the text. And I wanted to build a space where the text could be more kind of emotive in a way. So I built these kind of inside pages on the back of the Bible paper. And the text for this came from all the stories, and it came from thinking about search techniques on the web and thinking about databases. And what I actually did was I took all the text from all of the, I think there's 30 stories, and I took all the text and I'd do searches for different things. So this was every question that happened in those 30 stories, and then I put them back together to make a new piece of text. I think this was every sentence that began with the word I. And it became a kind of exercise partly in sort of concrete poetry, but also in actually then in interpreting those things typographically as well, and still trying to build this kind of intimate space in this very small book. And there were some other kind of strategies that came out of it. There were then just textual descriptions of the objects themselves, as if it was on a website when a long time ago when you couldn't load the image and you could choose to have a text description of what that image was. I made 2 catalogs for CalArts, and these are the admissions bulletins. And this first one was with Jeff McFetridge, who I used to share a studio with. And the idea was really to try and represent the institution in a way that perhaps was more about the experience of being at CalArts. Since I'd been a student there, I felt that I'd understood it in a kind of intimate way, in a way that perhaps the administration didn't understand their own school. And we shot a bunch of video. We tried to have tracks of narrative reading through the bulletin that showed people arriving at school, from kind of from driving up the freeway to entering the school. And to begin with, are these kind of anonymous shapes, and they somehow find a kind of identity as they progress through the book. And we tried to work with the school photographers, which ended up being kind of a nightmare. And we went back and just rummaged through all their material, and we found all the shots that they'd rejected, and the things that they'd considered to be wrong and bad and that they didn't like. All the things that were kind of overexposed and out of focus, and the end of the film had got double exposed or something. And those were the photographs that we started to use as sort of full bleed images. And one of the other things we did was to create this kind of structure and then pour everything into it. So we knew all the faculty bios were meant to be a maximum of 300 words. And I liked this idea of creating a structure that would show how much text people had written. And in my mind, it was somehow about how big people's egos were. Because a lot of the time, the people that were very accomplished and, say, a successful filmmaker or a writer, they would write a very short bio. And then the people that actually weren't very successful would overcompensate and try and write as much as possible about everything they'd ever done. So we created this very visible structure where you could visually kind of measure people's egos in a way. And out of that, we started to use the same structure to kind of divide photographs and become a grid. So some of these were photographs that were kind of rejected. And it became this very kind of very visible structure as well. And this was highly ill-considered. This was an application form that was made of forms. And the idea was that it was printed in blue ink, so that when you photocopied it, the blue blobs would disappear, and you'd just be left with these boxes and the pieces you were meant to fill in. And it didn't work. So the admissions office hated us because you'd photocopy it and they'd get darker and you couldn't read anything. It was a little bit of a disaster. because I've been thinking about how these systems worked and how, it was also because I was starting to do a lot of book design and I was trying to figure out how the systems work over a series of pages as well. I was asked to make a piece of work, I was asked to submit some work actually for a book called Restart, which was about systems in graphic design. And I wrote back to them saying, I don't really have anything that's going to look cool when it's published in your book. Can I just have some pages and can I write something and make some work for the book? And they said, okay, that's fine. And part of that problem is I do a lot of book design, and book design tends not to reproduce very well in other books. So it looks very boring. You don't get the physical object anymore. So I talked them into giving me these pages, and what I wanted to try and do was to actually talk about systems in graphic design historically, and in particular the idea of the kind of the modernist system and the grid, and how that had kind of developed into a sort of postmodern system and then had come back as a kind of modernist, again as a modernist system, but as a more of an aesthetic system, as a system that was stripped of its ideology. And I was actually interested in the fact that it was stripped of its ideology, and that left a space for people to actually try and put their own ideology, their own kind of thought and contents back into what's essentially this kind of aesthetic of modernism. So the first 2 pages show a kind of grid structure, and I worked with, my wife's a photographer, and she let me use a bunch of her photographs for this. So the first page is setting up the idea of kind of, partly of sort of erasing and taking apart the structure of the book and history, and it shows all the pieces and how those pieces might be used. And the next 2 pages are about my wife and I, and they're kind of about putting a personal content into this impersonal frame of modernism, that you could take something that was very intimate and put it into this space, and it would still feel in some ways cold and in some ways generic. And then I became interested in kind of making that, trying to personalize that system, creating a methodology that I could use to develop and kind of deconstruct and reconstruct, excuse me, the idea of modernism. So I started to take that grid and fill it with different things and create a set of rules for myself that I would follow and repeat and follow and repeat to kind of break down this systematized design. And it was kind of a way of sort of trying to personalize systematic design as well. And it made me think about what design is as a practice, in that we're often kind of arranging pieces of other people's work. And sometimes it feels like that's all you do as a designer. You have a number of pieces of furniture in a room, and all you do is kind of arrange those given pieces of furniture. And that's where this quote comes from. This stylistic individuality exists within a system consisting of preformed components, only when the concept driving the construction is thoroughly considered. So I actually printed at the end of it my kind of system that I'd used for my methodology and my set of rules that I'd used. So my own process and methodology became the content for those pages, and as well as making those pages. And I got interested in this. It was also a way that I finally found to kind of gain control of something as a designer in an authorial way, to try and gain control of text and image and try and mesh the two things together in a way that they couldn't be separated anymore, that they were so interrelated that they had a kind of symbiotic relationship where they had to be interweaved. Have invisible reasons create visible form. A lot of the time, I try and add things to the books that I make. I try and look at the body of content and think about how I'm going to interpret that body of content, what my comment is about that body of content, or even what my personal relationship is to that body of content. And a lot of the time that fuels the kind of design I make, the kind of structure that I come up with. And often that isn't visible. Often it's just a way for me to make form. For instance, there's things in this book that relate to like a white Siemens Bible that I had when I was a kid. That nobody's going to understand that from looking at this. But in a way, it doesn't matter. In a way, those kind of personal interpretations are just a way for me to drive individual form making. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay for me to try and have these sub-narratives that are sometimes read and sometimes not read. In some ways, it's a strategy for me to make form, for these invisible kind of ideas to actually make this visible form. So this was a small book that I made for Bas Jan Ader, who's a Dutch performance artist who used to live here in LA in the late 60s and early 70s. And he actually died during a performance where he was sailing a small sailing boat from New York to Falmouth in England, which is about 20 miles away from where I grew up as a child. And the bottom image is the very last picture that was ever taken of him, which is his sailing boat being towed out of the harbor. And it has the date, it's a still from a Super 8 film, and it has the date printed on it, and it's slide number 13 with this little red cross on it, which is kind of eerie. And what I tried to do, a lot of his work is about falling, and a lot of it's about drowning, and in a lot of ways, a lot of his work predicts his own death. And after he died, they found a novel in his locker, and the novel is about a sailor who fakes his own death. And for a long time, people refused to acknowledge that he died. His boat was washed up in Ireland, and they refused to acknowledge that he died. They actually thought that he'd faked his own death, and it was part of one of his performance pieces. And his work has this very strange balance between being very funny and being very sad. And I tried to capture some of those things. So from the front, there's this little blue line that's kind of like a horizon line, but it's also like this level of kind of a tear. And the first few pages are shots of him from a video, and it's really hard to tell whether he's kind of laughing or crying. And in a way, it creates this perfect kind of feeling that runs throughout all his work. And the structure of the book itself, I tried to create a lot of white space, this kind of, this revered sort of holy space in a way. But then the grid for a lot of the book is kind of pulled to the bottom of the page, and it's sunken. It's either fallen down or it's at the bottom of the ocean in a way. And a lot of the still frames that run at the top of the page are about things that are kind of lighter, or things that are uplifting. And I got to do this book because somebody that I went to school with, Brad Spence, actually curated the show at UC Irvine, and there was hardly any money to do the catalog. He literally just turned up at my studio with a box and said, "Can you make a book out of this?" And it was Bas Jan Ader's notebook and some bits of Super 8 film and some drawings. And so these are things like, these are little clips from Super 8 film. So again, a lot of this was kind of, often, books seem to be about this kind of invisible art of creating an atmosphere within the book itself. And this was really about trying to create something that felt sympathetic to his work. And this was a double-page spread from one of the books where he made this great film where he rides a bicycle into a canal in Amsterdam. And this is going to come up again in a minute. This was another catalog that I made for CalArts with Jeff Kaplan, was a designer in LA and now lives in San Francisco. And in some ways it developed the kind of strategies from the first book, in that we saw a giant divide between how the institution viewed CalArts and how the students and the faculty viewed CalArts. And looking back at it historically, it seems like it was kind of accurate at the point in that in recent years the administration is trying to legitimize CalArts and make it be perhaps more like a university and less like the kind of dope-smoking hippie school that it used to be. Because of that divide, we created a structure for this book where when you first open the book, all you see are these very dull pages of text. Everything's set in the same size text. And the only thing that changes is the column width kind of breathes and expands and contracts. And there's tiny little dotted lines everywhere. And after a while, you start to notice perforations in the pages. And this is the institutional view. It's all about the text. It's very dry. It's very uninspiring in a way. And what happens is there's little tiny hints that there's something more going on. And the book is printed in French folds, so it's bound backwards. And printed on the inside of each fold are these very dense, rich, four-color images. So the idea is that you can rip open each page. And the structure of the reason why the grids, the columns are like breathing is because they're following this internal structure. They're actually following what's happening inside with the students. So you can kind of open out these pages, and they're these very dense, very rich, kind of stripped together versions of events and things that happen at CalArts. And at the time I was really interested in film structure and how in a film you can have kind of foreshadowing and flashbacks and things happen over time. And I kind of got interested in how that might happen in graphic design. So a lot of these images were kind of stripped together, and you'd see a piece of them in one page, and then later on you'd see the whole image. And so you'd start to kind of, things would be kind of repetitious and things would be familiar. And they're also to do with this kind of experience of being at CalArts. We shot a lot of spaces empty and then shot them full of people and stripped the two things together. I was kind of interested in the idea of CalArts as an institution, as if it was empty, and then these different people occupying it, and thinking about what kind of memories or thoughts or what kind of traces were left behind in that space by the institution's own history, by the students' history. Kind of as if kind of memories could hang around as physical things. It was an unmitigated disaster. What happened was the art and design students would get the catalog and rip open all the pages and get really excited about it. And a lot of the students from theater and music would flip through it and, where are the pictures? It's really boring, I don't get it. And it failed miserably because they wouldn't actually kind of open this. And in another way it succeeded because it, in my mind anyway, it filtered out people that weren't being challenged by the object, that weren't, that weren't kind of visual and exciting people that wanted to rip this book open. That's my story. This is a book that I just finished for a show that's in Canada right now and is going to be at MoCA in about 6 months, I think. For Rodney Graham, who's a Canadian artist who makes a lot of work with film and video, still pieces. And his work has a lot to do with mirroring and repetition. And his work also has a lot to do with taking existing objects and replicating them in an incredibly fastidious way. So he'll replicate these kind of 18th century books and have them perfectly bound, and they'll be immaculate. And the book itself became a kind of sort of a reference to other art books in a very classical way, but it also very much came about, tried to replicate his idea of mirroring and his idea of doubling, and again a little bit like this, the CalArts catalog, but in a totally different way, the idea of sort of foreshadowing and of flashbacks, which seem to be, because there's themes that intertwine through his whole body of work. So it was a lot of fun to arrange his work, to try and form narratives out of his work. And again, I think people probably won't get the narratives on a conscious level, but perhaps on a subconscious level they'll work. So like this was the first series of images starts with this Alice in Wonderland book that's kind of, that's opening as if you're getting this insight into this book within a book. And then there's kind of references to sort of Alice in Wonderland and going down the rabbit hole and taking drugs. Rodney made a piece that relates to the Bas Jan Ader piece where he took acid in a park in Berlin and drove around on a bicycle. Oop. So there's kind of, there's mirroring that happens from page to page with the form of the figure, as well as, so formal and kind of conceptual ideas that force the sequence and structure of the book. Make type talk. I like type a lot. I think it's because I'm not necessarily a drawer. I don't draw a lot. I tend to express my ideas through words and typography. I actually got interested in graphic design because I liked writing. And I think when I look back at my work, this was a really early piece that I made as a student, and when I look back at my work, one thing that I've consistently done is try to express ideas and concepts through typography. And quite often it's really difficult, because there's a very fine line between doing something that's kind of subtle and doing something that's where the kind of secondary signifiers of the type, the things that it connotates rather than the word that it denotates, they really become overbearing very quickly. So these are a series of posters for different things that have tried to use typography as the main medium to talk about a particular idea. So they vary from being things that are more where the idea is carried out in the form of the letters, like something like this, to ideas where it's about a kind of structural device of the typography and not about the actual form of each individual letter. And there are times when it actually is all about the writing. This was a poster for an exhibition called Adversary, where you could write about a point of view about something within graphic design. And I was trying to make something that talked about questioning your design beliefs, trying to have some kind of conviction with the kind of work that you make rather than just replicating things that are happening in contemporary culture. And this was a poster that I made for a DVD for an artist called Kelly Nipper, which was about these 4 video panels that had these very oblique relationships between kind of emotion and ice and things spinning in this sort of circular way. And it was a very reduced, minimal way of trying to get at this relationship between these different things kind of continually circling. And this was a poster I just made with Mina Ko, who was a student at Cal Arts, which is based on a coffee mug from the 70s that says "I love you" in lots of different languages and type forms. About 2 years ago, I got a grant from the City of Los Angeles, the Cultural Affairs Department, to pretty much do anything that I wanted. And it had to result in some work that could be exhibited at the Japanese American Museum. And it's really strange because as a designer, a lot of the time you're looking for clients, you're trying to get work in a kind of commercial context. And this was really an opportunity for me to do something that was unrelated to a client. And it was terrifying to actually suddenly have somebody say, "Hey, you can do whatever you like." It's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And what happened was I knew I wanted to do something that was typographically based. I didn't really know what the content would be, what the words would be. And I started out trying to write things, and I kind of didn't want to do that. And I ended up trying to look at my own history in a way. And I came up with a set of, trying to think about, a little bit like the list that I read at the start of this talk. I was trying to think about what had influenced me culturally. And I came to the conclusion that most of the things that I learned in my life about politics or relationships or anything really came from songs. And they came from singing along to all these different songs. So I took various different songs that I thought were important, and they were generally also had a kind of theme of being English artists and being somehow kind of having a working class aesthetic to them, to the lyrics. And I was interested in what happens to lyrics when you take the music away. They turn into bad poetry. Like if you ever sit and read the lyric sheet from an album, it's terrible, it's awful. But if you listen to it with the music and you sing along, yeah, that's okay. So I got interested in what could take the place of the music if the music was taken away. And I tried to think about typography as being the music, whether it could actually replace this thing. So the first one was Common People by Pulp, and this was every song ever written by The Clash. And I like the idea that by overlaying these things, there became this kind of internal structure that somehow became visible. I was also interested in the idea of kind of typographic cliches in a way, that you would pick a particular genre of music and you would assign a certain typographic form to it. And I like the idea of kind of fucking with that and messing around with it. So this was kind of a sort of late modernist poster for Paranoid by Black Sabbath. So the form became kind of antithetical to the lyrics, or to the form that would normally be associated with those lyrics. And this was a poster for the Smiths, where all the naughty little letters are touching each other. And this was a poster for Love Will Tear Us Apart by Joy Division, which was trying to kind of get at the sort of, I guess the sort of sadness and fragile nature of a lot of their songs. In particular, I think this song. And again, this was using the typeface that Pete Bergeron had drawn initially for the Houses by Artists book. And I liked it because it kind of reveals its own structure in a way. There's something about it, I guess kind of there's a quote from Peter Saville about Joy Division where he says that, not Peter Saville, I can't remember, Tony Wilson, where he says the difference between kind of punk and Joy Division and post-punk was that in punk rock, everyone was saying, I'm going to fuck you up. And in Joy Division was saying, look at me, I'm fucked up. So I kind of like that. This was That's Entertainment by The Jam, which formed itself into a fairly depressing map of England, my hometown. And one of the other things I did with that project, I wanted to make type talk in a different way. There was one thing was to make type talk formally and structurally, and another thing was actually to try and make it talk as to create a dialogue, to make it actually somehow force a conversation. And I made a series of 200 buttons, little badges, and they were each different, and they were all lyrics from the Smiths. And I again, I went back to using kind of search engines in Quark and in Word. And so I'd searched, I got all the Smiths lyrics from everything they'd ever written and did searches for the instances of I and you and us and we. And there was something like, 5,000 I's and, 2,000 U's, and I think there were 20 us's. And it sort of made me realize as well about how lyrics function, that it's all about you singing along and relating to them. So if you're singing along and you're singing about I, you actually kind of relate to this. And I wondered how I could try and make that create a dialogue. So I took all these different buttons and I printed them all out in different colors and made them into this kind of little tiny strip of landscape that was hung on the gallery wall. And the idea was that during the opening of the exhibition, people could take these buttons and they would wear them, and they would see other people wearing those buttons, and they would interact with them and, oh, what does yours say? What does yours say? Oh, I'm this, I'm that. And because they were these declarative statements, they would be forced to begin with making a choice about which one they chose, but then also to be forced to have a conversation with somebody else. And in a way, I thought it was a kind of metaphor for the rest of the show was mainly artists as well. I think there were two architects, and there was me as a graphic designer, and I think there were 10 or 12 artists. And I like this idea of this being a metaphor for how design was different for art in a way, that I wanted it to try and create this somehow this vague cultural dialogue. So at the exhibition, people could take the buttons. And so as the evening progressed, it got less and less and less. To the point where I've deliberately made it go really high as well, so people would have to jump up and get them and humiliate themselves. And it got to the point where eventually there was one button left. And then what was left when they were all gone on the wall that you can barely see were this kind of set of like indexical marks of where the buttons had been. And in some way that was part of this metaphor for how graphic design was consumed, and what was left was this kind of trace element of it. And I did a similar piece with my wife in San Salvador at the National Museum there, which was based around David Bowie lyrics. And it was for a show that was about DJ culture. So I have two more things that I'm going to do. One thing is I'm going to read something while we're talking about type talking. This was a book called Metro Letters that Deb Littlejohn, who was someone I went to school with at Cal Arts, edited. And it was a competition for type design, and they wanted to use the type as an identity for Minneapolis and St. Paul. And they invited 6, I think, international type designers to submit proposals. And then from those proposals, they chose 1. And I wrote a piece of text for the book that accompanied this. And most of it's kind of conventional critical analysis about the typographic form. And then part of it is trying to jump out of that and write about typography in a different way. And I was interested in the kind of personality that I thought type might have. So it's called Constructions and Fabrications. There are 2 men at my door, dressed in dark grey and looking serious. On the left is a tall, thin gentleman, gaunt with even features. The man on the right is carrying encyclopedias. They ask me questions and try and sell me something. I have a funny feeling they want to teach me something. I'm in my pajamas and the brisk morning air is turning my feet purple. I glance at my toes, and when I look back up at the men, their appearance seems to have changed. The tall, skinny man now appears shorter than I remembered, and broader too. He's definitely the same man, but his appearance has shifted. The man on the right seems to be dressed in different clothes now. Sorry. He still holds the encyclopedias, but his suit is lighter and the cut sharper. I close the door before they can finish speaking to me, and I think to myself, it's going to be a strange day. I leave the house to walk down the street to the grocery store. I need bread and milk. Don't get distracted by the special offers. Don't forget the essentials. The street seems strange, its angles harsher than usual, more uniform. I find myself more aware of the architecture than I ever have been, and while I'm gazing up at the buildings, I walk smack into a lady pushing a baby stroller. My force knocks the stroller over, and the 2 babies inside roll across the pavement. I rush to pick them up before they can come to any harm. The first child is skinny and energetic, screaming and throwing her arms around wildly. The second child is rotund, stronger and heavier than her sibling, yet stoic and silent. I tuck one under each arm and return them back to the stroller. They seem happier now that they're all back together. It's only now that I notice their mother, elegant and composed, a woman whose unconventional beauty steals my breath for a second. He's working on the construction site again. I see him every day when I go out for my daily walk. He always wears the same clothes, simple black jeans and a long-sleeved black shirt. He's tall and well-built, a strong man with plenty of muscle. He's working hard, bending rods of metal into perfectly shaped loops. He takes his job seriously. You can tell, the pride is clear. He looks like he's worked on the construction site for all his life, and that he'd be happy to stay there too. I wave to him and he waves back. As he turns around to bend more metal, I notice a copy of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities in his back pocket. I buy what I need from the shops. I manage to stick to the basics as much as I can, just what I need. The checkout clerk rings up the prices. As usual, it's more than I thought, and I don't have enough money. At first, she looks like the other checkout girls, but when I look at her face more closely, she's strange and pretty. Her features all a little too large or too small. I think she's maybe from another country. She smiles and lets me off paying the few cents I don't have. As I leave the store, I think to myself that I'd like to get to know her better, even though I know I'll never see her again. The bags are heavy. I take the bus home. There's a familiar-looking man sitting opposite me, but I can't recall where I've seen him before. Perhaps he just reminds me of someone else. He's immaculately dressed, well-groomed and stylish. His features are plain but honest. He has a good face, I think to myself. Then I notice a small scar on his cheek, just below his left eye, and a tattoo of Snoopy on the underside of his right wrist. Now the longer I look at him, the more unfamiliar he seems. When I reach my house, the front door is already open. I walk in. There's a man sitting in my armchair watching television, but the television is off, the screen dark. Every time he presses the remote control, his face changes expression. He runs through a range of emotions, sometimes serious, sometimes comical. I put my shopping bags on the floor so I can watch him. He turns his head towards me and smiles. I smile back. He seems very friendly, and I don't mind having him in my house. "Which one do you like best?" he asks me. "All of them," I reply. So I have one last thing to show you. Practice visual karaoke. I think a lot of the time, as a designer, I think I tend to get caught up in the sort of serious nature of design, particularly of designing catalogs and books and publications, and I tend to kind of lose sight of the fact that that I really like design. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the big list at the beginning was to stop myself being cynical, was to remind myself why I'm doing this, and to think to myself that I'm actually really lucky that I get to make work that I really like. I get to do a job that I really like, and every now and then I think it's really important to kind of step back and not take everything so seriously, and to just have fun making something in a very, very fast way, in a very short way, just to kind of have fun with it. And so I've done a few projects over the last 2 years that have involved making videos, making music videos and making karaoke videos and making animations for cell phones, and things that are deliberately made in a couple of days and that are kind of like guerrilla graphics in a way, things that are not concerned with finesse and polish. They're just a kind of raw idea as a way to stay excited about making graphic design. And one of those I turned into a project. I made a karaoke video, and I kind of had so much fun doing it. I made it into a project, and I went to the Jan van Eyck in Maastricht and did a 3-day workshop with their students there, where they had to make a karaoke video, and we had 3 days from start to finish to make it and to host an event. And there were only 4 or 5 students that actually did the project, and so they made me do it as well, because there weren't enough of them. So I thought I'd end just by showing you my karaoke video. And it's actually 2 shots. It's meant to be 1 shot, but I couldn't quite do it. The first minute of it, there's no sound. Thank you. Do you guys want to do questions? No? Okay.
All right, thanks.